You haven't asked me at all what I do. And I'm like, hey, if you're in the meeting, you're doing something big. Like whether I filtered it, my team filtered it, you're doing something that impacts a lot of people. I barely need to filter the idea. Like I shouldn't, in fact. But if you're choosing the next 15 years to work on something that we have deemed important, now I need to figure out who's going to be building it, and you need to know yourself enough.
You are listening to The Sure Shot Entrepreneur, a podcast for founders with ambitious ideas. Venture capital investors and other early believers tell you relatable, insightful, and authentic stories to help you realize your vision. Welcome to The Sure Shot Entrepreneur. I'm your host, Gopi Rangan. My guest today is Adam Draper. Adam is the founder and managing director at Boost VC. Adam is a very unique person, truly unique. He is one of the very, very few people who is actually born and raised in Silicon Valley. He comes from this famous family of Drapers. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And we will ask him about how he invests in startups. He mainly invests at pre-seed, seed stages. And he's a prolific investor. And he recently raised a new fund at Boost VC, and the total amount of money raised is $876,54321.
That's right.
Adam, welcome to the Sure Shot Entrepreneur.
Thanks for having me, Gopi.
I'm excited to have this conversation, but let's start with you. Give us a quick background about you. You grew up in the Bay Area. You went to high school on the East Coast, but you came back. But your family's been here for a long time, and you are a native Silicon Valley kid. Right?
Yeah, well, I can tell this story in a few ways, and I'll do the origin Draper story first, which
please.
It was, I believe, the 50s. My grandfather, Bill Draper, was working at Inland Steel, which is a steel company in Illinois, Indiana. And he was starting to be like getting promoted through the ranks. And at one point, my great-grandfather called him, and he was on the West Coast now, and he said, Bill, you want to come out to Silicon Valley? We're going to do venture capital. Venture capital at the time wasn't a thing. It wasn't like well known. It was, we're going to invest in early stage startups. And my grandfather took it as a huge opportunity to go work with his dad. He had had a career up to this point. My great grandfather was actually a 4-star general. He ran the Marshall Plan in Europe, and he led the execution of it. But when he left the military, he started a venture fund. And so he came out, it was Draper, Gaither, and Anderson in the orchards of Silicon Valley. I have breakfast with my grandfather every 2 weeks, so I still get to hear all these awesome stories. And he always tells this story where he told his boss at Inland Steel that he was leaving, and his boss yelled at him for 2 straight hours. He's saying, you're wasting your life, you're losing your career, you're doing all this stuff. At the end of it, my grandfather said, I knew I was making the right call. And so he packed up, he left, he drove from Illinois to California, and he worked with his grandfather. Draper, Gaither, and Anderson, unfortunately, only lasted 7 years because one of them died. But my grandfather got the taste of what venture capital was, and he ended up leaving, launching a fund with his best friend, Pitch Johnson. Pitch, I believe, worked at Inland Steel also, so they both came out. And he wanted to start something. And so at some point, they broke off. And my grandfather, Bill Draper, co-founded Sutter Hill Ventures, which is still around today, with Paul Weiss, and Pitch Johnson ended up going off and founding a company, but realized he ended up investing and being a huge part of Amgen, which is a huge bio fund, and founded asset management later and went back to investing. My grandfather ran Sutter Hill Ventures for a while. At that time, I think historical context is important, which is like, the orchards of Silicon Valley didn't have that much technology in it. And so he would go up and down the roads knocking on doors with anything that said tech or technology on it. And he'd say, hey, I'd like to talk to the president here. And the person at the front desk would say, who are you? And they would say, we're venture capitalists. And they said, what is that? And then he'd say, we want to invest in your startup. And then she'd immediately go, or he would immediately go and go get the president. that worked pretty well. You'd go up and down, drive up and down Silicon Valley near Stanford, and you would find very talented people who were starting things. It was still a very small industry, though. The transition from small industry, which was like friends backing all the founders around Stanford, turned into there was this moment my grandfather also talks about, which is there was this day where the CEO of Goldman Sachs was in his office and they have a conversation and he realized on Wall Street at this time, it was the 60s kind of thing, they were struggling to get 7% a year in returns. And my grandfather and his friends were busy making 42% a year in Silicon Valley. And so that was the end of an era, which was this small, almost apprenticeship of the Silicon Valley that would become a huge thing, where he jokes the CEO of Goldman Sachs went back to New York, backed up a truck from New York to Silicon Valley full of money and just like dumped it. That's kind of right at the moment when my grandfather went and he was asked to work for the government. So he worked for the Export-Import Bank under Reagan and Bush and was the Undersecretary General of the UN. And during that time, my dad started in venture capital. I was 0 years old and he started in venture capital. And my dad, he starts with like $2 million in investments, but no actual value to them. And he actually went to the SBA. They had a lending program called the SBIC where you could leverage your investments. And so he went and he said, I have this portfolio that I would like more capital to be able to invest in small businesses. And he talks to them and they say, well, you need at least 12 years of investment experience. And he goes, well, I've been investing since I was 12. And so they go check. They go down the whole list. Now SBA is like 2,000 people. This was like a team of 6 in the government who was like trying to facilitate more growth in the economy. And my dad ends up investing in about 20 companies, 15 companies out of all the money. So he was able to leverage the fund and he was able to get about $4 to $6 million from the government. He invested and a lot of them didn't work, but he had one deal and I always like to give tribute to that deal. It was called Parametric Technologies, which was a huge win. He went from being the most hated person inside the SBA at the SBIC program to being the most loved within a year because he had to keep going back and be like, hey, it's going to happen. Fly to DC and just talk to them one more time. Don't call your loan was essentially the thing. The IPO window opened, Parametric Technologies went out. He was able to settle the whole debt. And that was where Draper Associates was started. I think a lot of people don't give my dad credit for, he was alone building Draper Associates before he had his partner Fisher Jurvetson for 7 years. So he was just an alone venture capitalist for like 7 years. And then he partnered up with Fisher and then they needed a tiebreaker. So they partnered up with Jurvetson, who's brilliant. They're both fantastic partners to my dad. And they built this incredible fund where my grandfather was the earliest in solidifying Silicon Valley as an institution. My dad actually took venture capital global. And so he was the first one to ever franchise the venture capital fund structure. I love everything my family's done for this industry, the world. Like we've been a small part of so many great wins. I haven't even talked about the wins that my grandpa had or my dad had. Like grandfather backed early computing. And then he always talks about he found Skype. And then my dad always says, I found Skype, which is a funny debate that they do. But my dad was the investor in Hotmail, Skype, anything that sort of was communication related on the internet. My dad innately understood how people were going to translate that. Then they went international. Skype, Baidu, had a couple other huge wins. From that, I grew up just having entrepreneurs be this heart of a lot of business stories. And one of the beautiful things about my family is that my dad liked working. So it was never a bad thing in our family. It was always like, oh, I get to go to work, rather than like, I gotta, go grind today. It was like, I get to go to work. I get to like go meet these great people who are going to change things. And he learned probably how technology worked through our eyes. But I got a front row seat in Silicon Valley to like the rise of Napster and the rise of all these different products. And I got to fall in love with my computer and how my computer worked. I ended up going to boarding school in Andover, Massachusetts. And then in between high school and college, I took a year off and played tennis in Australia. Then I went to UCLA And throughout that time, I'd been a tennis counselor. I'd been a telemarketer. I actually went to a comic book store so often that they offered me a job. I didn't take it, but I was there so often that they were like, "You're here anyway. Do you want to get paid instead of paying us?" Debating character releases and stuff. And then at my senior year, one of my friends approached me, Thomas Foley, and he said, "I'm going to start this company. Do you want to start a company?" And I founded a company. It was a secondary market for private securities called Expert Financial in 2008. And at this point, venture had gone through big growth and contract and growth and contract. And it had become really an asset class where it was definitely not really an asset class when my grandfather was around it. I had grown up around startups, so I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do with my life. So yeah, let's do it. When I go in on something, I go all in. And so I committed, I became his co-founder. The thing I loved about starting a company was like, in school, they teach you the right answer. In work, there's no right answer. There's only the right answer on the day, the best answer on the day. And it's when I realized that, all of a sudden I was like, I can do this. And so I like went ham and I just worked like through my 20s. I was just like, I was working. And it was just an incredible experience. I learned so much at Expert Financial. When we eventually had to wind that down, I left Expert Financial to actually launch a product I wanted to launch inside of Expert Financial that was a crowdfunding website for startups. And what we learned, my partner, who I've been partners with for 13 years now, Brayton Williams, what we learned was that no one really cared about the crowdfunding aspect of it, but they really cared that they were getting their first investment. And so we actually transitioned this $500,000 that we had raised from being like a company to being a fund. And so we were like, okay, we have $500,000. How do we make this work to invest in things? And so we started to invest. And I've been fortunate. Slowly, I've been able to gain enough credibility that my fund sizes have grown. Our network has grown. Our experience as being sort of investing in the fringes of different technologies has grown. And so we're 13, 14 years later, and I'm still going to have a blast doing what I'm doing.
What an amazing story. Fascinating. Now, going back to your grandfather, he was a student of George Dorio, who's now called the father of venture capital. He was a professor at Harvard. And if I am right, both George Dorio and your grandfather were both military veterans. And what an amazing story where you're a third generation venture capital investor.
You want to know my grandfather's best pick was, though? He was a military vet. His dad was in the military, too. And when he went back to visit, he had gotten out of the war, and the first week out of the Korean War, he took a cruise. And within 3 days, he proposed to my grandmother. And he still to this day says the greatest decision I ever made was marrying your grandmother. I think that's very telling. He's the most charming man on the planet, loved his wife very much, and he's just a good dude. I actually don't know that he was a student of Dario. I didn't know that. That's cool.
Your grandfather deployed the first few dollars, and then your father took it global, and he deployed the first few $1 million or tens of millions of dollars. In today's world, that has become an asset class, and it has attracted billions of dollars. Maybe one of the first conversations was when the CEO of Goldman Sachs was at your grandfather's office. Since then, money has been flowing in this direction and has fueled the innovation economy. In today's world, where venture capital is in this landscape, where does Boost VC fit in? What do you focus on?
Yeah, I look at the world in terms of two things. There's early stage venture capital. We'll define it as product market fit venture capital. And in pre-seed, where I am, or early stage, the game is about optimizing for luck. And it's about giving people shots to be able to build the future that they want to build, to take on the challenge of what I call endeavors of consequence, right? And above that line, the game is about access, getting access to deals. Because you know what 5 deals in that market are the best deals. So like if I'm looking for ride sharing apps, I know what the best 5 deals are, right? And I'm going to try to pile on money into those things. That's a different stage of venture capital. My stage of venture capital, where I believe I have asymmetric abilities just because I'm willing to take more risk than anyone else, is in the optimization of luck. You could say it's because I grew up with my dad who takes a lot of risk and my grandfather who's good with people. And I was defined also by incredible women in my family. I have an incredible mom and sisters and cousins. So I've been very lucky on the family front in general. What I do is you find where there's smoke and you follow the data points to say that there's smoke. And sometimes you can't see the smoke. It's like finding fire in the middle of the night when you don't have eyes and you're like trying to like search around. You're like, is this a thing? What's the thing? What's it shaped like? Does it look like an elephant? Is it hot? Whatever the thing is. And I think what I like doing is taking that kernel of something wonderful, of an idea, and saying, do I believe that this person is going to work for 10 years on it? And if they're going to work for 10 years on it, they're going to make a progress. It might not be a category defining company. They might just kick the can down the road and make a lot of progress towards a better future that I would love to live in. Everyone looks at what we do: jetpacks, exoskeletons, nuclear radiation, space, oceans, crypto, like whatever the thing is. And they look at it and they say, oh, that's so future facing. I actually think that I'm taking the traditional model of venture capital back to its roots of just saying, hey, this is something we need in the world. And no company's going to back it. No big venture fund's going to back it, and no government's going to back it. But it's valuable. And I don't know how to define that value other than I feel it. And so once you feel something, you're like, I want to feel it again. And you keep trying to do that. So in today's world, venture capital is saturated if you're trying to do what everyone else is doing. To my success and detriment, I continue to try to make the bet on the highest risk I can.
You're also a very, very active investor. How many deals do you do in a year?
It's about a deal and a half a week. So it's something like 75, 80 deals probably this year that we'll hit. It might be more, it might be a little less, and it's not a target anymore. There was a moment in time where we made some bad decisions because we were focused on that being a target, where we were like, we want to do the most deals. But it's just our deal engine, I feel very confident, attracts high quality people doing risky things. That, like, it's about taking the risk that no one else is willing to take. And so rather than focusing on what market or industry or thesis we have, I'd say one of the things we've become known for is just we do high volume. Like, we do a high velocity of deals, and that gives you direct access to that year, that vintage. For the LP, that's what they kind of are thinking. They're like, okay, well, I'm allocated to innovation this year. That seems like a good thing. But what we're trying to do is just, I'm so curious about where the world's spinning and where the biggest problems are. And sometimes we get to be a small piece of that. I learned so much in this job, and that's really what keeps me going, where I get to help people, I get to unlock people, and then I get to be insatiably curious about, like, wait, how would that work? It's like studying how Monopoly was designed rather than just playing by the rules that were created. And you learn a lot about yourself when you've been doing something for 13 years. I've really been doing for 15. Yeah.
The first investor often in all of these companies, and you focus quite a bit on deep tech. Can we talk about some interesting trends and what gets you excited?
Yeah, of course. Well, first, I should probably say a few companies in the portfolio just to give like context. Great, of like where we are. So my first deal I ever did as an investor failed, unfortunately. It was called Path. It was a social networking app like Instagram, but they were building a slightly different community. And it was started by incredible people. One of the founders was Sean Fanning, and he started Napster. And in some ways I invested just because I was like, hey, I want to thank you for Napster. And what I learned in that was that every investment, one of the beautiful things about every investment is that it becomes a micro network. So if you are curious and want to, you get to meet all of the other investors in that company. You get to meet all the network of other startups that company knows. And so if that's a good, well-networked company, you actually get, just by nature of showing up to stuff, to be a part of that network. And so I got to meet like the CEO of Lyft through that. And I missed Lyft from my perspective, not from his. But like, I didn't invest because I was like, oh, it'd be interesting to invest in this thing. They're trying to raise like $1 million to launch. They've been working on it for 7 years, and all they needed was $1 million to be able to launch this Lyft product. And I was like, this guy's great. And he ended up coming and speaking. He was one of our first speakers at Boost VC, where we would bring in speakers. And he broke my drone. So he still owes me a drone. And so that was my first investment. But then over the course of 2 to 3 years, I invested in about 20 deals before I started Boost VC. And they ended up being huge. Like I ended up getting 6 out of 23 that ended up becoming billion-dollar companies. I did Coinbase, I did Amplitude, I did Benchling, I did a company called Wave Mobile Money that no one knows that's huge. I bought some Bitcoin. PlanGrid was a huge exit. I always leave it in there. It was sold for like $900 million. I leave it in there. It was not a billion-dollar company. But at that year, those were all the neglected deals. And so I've always had this affinity for deals that don't have investors, and they're not popular because of some reason or another. They're taking too big of a risk. They're an unproven founder, whatever the thing is. I want to know the risk I'm taking and I want to take it. So those were some of the early deals. And then I launched Boost VC. We became known for Bitcoin related investments. We did very, very well as a Bitcoin-oriented investor for lots of different founders in that industry. Some of the most category-defining companies in crypto were founded by Boost VC investments early. And we didn't have a big fund. We made a big impact with very little money, which was really, really impressive to me. And I'm very proud of. And then we've always wanted to punch above our weight class, deliver more value than we have in money. And then we ended up migrating to other technologies. We were like, oh, virtual reality is really interesting. Just by nature of the types of talented people who are walking through our door, the crazy thing about Bitcoin being our first industry was that all Bitcoin founders are early adopters and they know a lot of people who are starting companies in other areas. A huge win, I think, represents Boost VC really well is a company founded by a guy named Doug Bernauer. It's called Radiant Nuclear. It's an awesome nuclear company. They're building micro nuclear reactors at scale. That company came from a Bitcoin referral, a guy named Jared who referred us because he knew us from Bitcoin and liking weird stuff. He just referred us this nuclear deal. I think a big part of it is there's almost a personality trait of weirdness that we are attracted to. And that happens to have enough of a mentality of rebellion. We are attracted to that type of founder. It's like in high agency weirdness. Like, they're known for something in their friend group. They're obsessed with Pokemon. They're always collecting. They have some weird trait about them that they're always trying to change things. And that's the type of founder we like.
Yeah. The underdogs and the quirkiness, something new that's coming up, and they're always on top of it. And those are the type of people you attract. What's your advice to founders when they come to meet you? What's the best way to make that meeting productive? Beyond have your pitch deck ready and all that normal stuff. Can you share a couple of tips or 3 tips?
I think entrepreneurs in that first meeting, they always hate meeting me because it's impossible to prepare for, and not in an intimidating way. I'm just curious. So I will ask every question that I can think of. And they are so prepared to pitch their business. And all I'm trying to do is assess them. And so often that has a collision where they're like, you haven't asked me at all what I do. And I'm like, hey, if you're in the meeting, you're doing something big. Whether I filtered it, my team filtered it, you're doing something that impacts a lot of people. I barely need to filter the idea. I shouldn't, in fact. But if you're choosing the next 15 years to work on something that we have deemed important, now I need to figure out who's going to be building it, and you need to know yourself enough for this to be a big business. And so that's what I'm doing. I'm trying to figure out who you are, which there's no screening. There's no tips for, right? You don't try to portray something else would probably be my advice is don't say you're good at something that you're not good at. It's not a resume thing. I just want to know that you're grounded in something and that you have a center piece where you make decisions from. And if I can figure that out, we will do that deal all day. And if I can't figure that out, sometimes we'll still take the risk because we think it's too cool. Normally they're breadcrumbs that entrepreneurs have. People don't sprout up from the lava ooze and all of a sudden they're entrepreneurs. I think that CEOs are grown. You earn it. And so it's I'm trying to bet on the person you're going to be, not the person you are. And so I need to know that you have a consistent decision-making paradigm that comes from something. Have you made hard decisions? Have you ever fired someone? What do your parents do? Are you close with your siblings? it's not that there's a right or wrong answer. Like a lot of people are probably trying to think that there's a right or wrong answer. It's more just like, is there an answer? And do you have a way you think about it? And so I'm just trying to figure out, when you are presented with a difficult problem or question, do you solve it? Are you curious to solve the question in front of you? Or are you just going to try to get back to script? Getting back to script's the worst. If you want to know what not to do, is try to get back to your PowerPoint presentation.
It's a safer thing to do for founders. This is a fascinating conversation.
And we lose. By the way, I'm not the arbiter of all success. We have done pretty well because of our business model, because we're attracted to a specific type of founder, like all those things. But I still miss. I was just thinking, I have emails from like 3 founders who I love, who we basically like just missed and we should have had. Yeah.
Everybody has
and like that happens.
Anti-portfolio, like the Lyft is on your anti-portfolio.
Oh yeah, dude. Biggest miss was Ethereum, probably financially, because they had a token launch that anyone could participate in. And our office was just filled with people participating. And I was like, Bitcoin needs to work. And that's where I learned, don't be stubborn, be high conviction.
We're coming towards the end of our conversation, and I want to ask you about your community involvement. Is there a nonprofit organization you are passionate about? Which one?
That's a good question. I have a lot of stances on nonprofits in general. There's one that I do consistently support. My wife and I get together every year and we think about like what causes we would like to support and stuff. And I have a pretty big passion for the ocean. And there's a nonprofit called the Ocean Cleanup, led by a guy named Boyan Slot. And I would rather him be a startup, because the ocean is this unownable for now thing. He kind of needs to be a nonprofit or an NGO type situation. So I support him by just donating some money every year.
Adam, thank you very much for spending time with me today. Thank you for sharing amazing stories from your family to your investment activities and to a window into who you are. It is just simply fascinating for me to watch this and learn from your history. I look forward to sharing your nuggets of wisdom with the world.
By the way, one of the things I want to say, like just at the end of this, is like, I think one of the things I believe that other people might not is that when you believe that something is risky, like a career decision, most decisions, by the way, are 50-50. Mike Maples said that to me. He said, most decisions are 48-52. Yeah, sure. If I ate a hamburger for lunch, it's probably worse than a salad, but it's not going to change the trajectory of my life. But there are, every once in a while, you run into 20-80, like a huge dichotomy decision. And you need to really think about it and put a time spectrum on it. But I would say most people run into a situation and they think, oh, I'm not going to do this because the safe thing is this. This is the stable, safe thing. I actually believe that what we believe to be risky in that situation is the least risky. Taking a chance on myself has consistently been the best decision I've made. And so whenever you bet that you'll figure it out, you do. And I think that most people have this programming of risk that is actually, that discomfort makes them think that they're getting comfortable. And it's actually the highest risk you can take on your career, on your life, on your whatever, because your decision making that we were talking about earlier is safety, comfort, and you think that you're still going to get freedom. And what you end up doing, you end up having less choice in that bucket. If you just want comfort, that's okay, but you get less freedom. If you're looking for freedom, creativity, like all those things, you want to be in the other bucket. You want to be high risk because you're one of one who has taken that risk, which means you are the best at it. You are the only one doing it. And all you have to do is educate the people around you that it's a thing. And then all of a sudden it's a thing. And you're like, oh, yeah, it's a thing. I cut wigwams with my claws and it's a thing. I just cut wigwams.
That's who you are. And that's the kind of founders you want to work with as well. This is a great way to finish this conversation. I look forward to sharing this with all the founders who are hopefully ready to talk to you and tell their story.
Gopi, thanks for having me, man.
Thank you very much. Thank you for listening to The Sure Shot Entrepreneur. I hope you enjoyed listening to real-life stories about early believers supporting ambitious entrepreneurs. Please subscribe to the podcast and post a review. Your comments will help other entrepreneurs find this podcast. I look forward to catching you at the next episode.